Let's learn about IELTS listening test question types. The IELTS listening test has three main question types. 1. Fill in the gaps questions. 2. Multiple choice questions. 3. Map questions. Each of these question types tests a different set of skills, and therefore each question type requires a different strategy. Now let's look at multiple choice questions. Multiple choice questions present you with questions which have several possible answers. You need to select the correct answer or answers from a range of options. How they look. Here's an example of what multiple choice questions look like. Skills tested. 1. Vocabulary range. Multiple choice questions test your vocabulary range by giving you words in the answers which are not exactly the same as the words that you hear. They will have the same meaning as the words that you hear, but they won't be exactly the same words. And this will test your vocabulary range, in particular, your knowledge of synonyms. 2. Listening comprehension. This is a test of how well you understand what you hear. You must be able to not only recognize the words in the sentences you hear, but also understand their function and purpose. Now let's look in detail at how multiple choice questions test these skills. Multiple choice questions test your vocabulary range by giving you words in the answers which do not match exactly the words that you hear. The correct answer will have the same meaning as the words that you hear, but it will probably not use the same words. Let's look at this sample question. The question is, for Anna, the most significant point about food waste is, and then we have three possible answers. A. The moral aspect. B. The environmental impact. C. The economic effect. With a multiple choice question, you are more likely to hear the words in the question than the words in the three possible answers. So don't just look at the words in the answers and wait to hear those words, thinking that's how you'll get the answer. You might not ever hear any of those words. Additionally, in this case, if the answer is B, the environmental impact, you will probably not hear that phrase. You will hear something which has the same meaning, but which uses different words, such as the effect on the ecology. Multiple choice questions test your listening comprehension by using distractors. These are words which sound like the right answer, but they are not. They're trying to take your attention away from the right answer. Let's look at the sample question again. We can see that answer A talks about the moral aspect, answer B talks about the environmental impact, and answer C talks about the economic effect. In the listening exercise, you might hear something about morality, something about the environment, and something about the economy. However, they can't all be right. Just because you hear a word which is one of the words in the answers doesn't mean that is the correct answer. If it sounds like you've heard more than one of these answers, then you should realize you've heard at least one distractor. Strategy. In your preview time, before the listening exercise starts, follow this process. 1. Identify key words in the question. Multiple choice questions usually, though not always, have two important pieces of information. One is the subject, which is the thing you want to know about, and the other is the qualifier or modifier, which is information about the thing you want to know about. Let's look at our sample question again. In this question, the subject is a point about food waste. We know this because each of the answers is information about food waste. The qualifier is the phrase most significant. In a multiple choice question, the subject is usually a noun or a verb, So the qualifier is usually an adjective, often a comparative or superlative, or an adverb. The way to find the correct answer is to listen for a word which means the same thing as the qualifier. In this case, you might not hear the phrase most significant, but you will hear words which mean the same thing, such as most important, or essential, or critical. Certain types of words are always key words in multiple choice questions. Comparatives and superlatives, such as more and most, or adjective er, adjective est, are always key words. And when you see these, you should know you are probably going to hear distractors, and it's likely you will hear something that sounds like all of the answers. Time words are also key words in multiple choice questions. This includes words like next, after, previously, before, immediately, and straight away. Again, when you see these words in the question, you can guess you're going to hear distractors, and you'll probably hear something that sounds like all three answers. 2. Check for distractors. Often it's possible to identify if the question will use distractors and even what those distractors will look like. When you see answers which share one or more words or which sound similar, then you will probably hear distractors. In fact, you might even hear information which sounds like all three answers. Let's look at some examples. This question says, guests will start arriving at, and there are three possible answers. A, 10:15. B, 12:15. C, 2:30. You can tell that 10:15 and 12:15 sound quite similar. So it's quite likely that one of them is the correct answer and the other one is the distractor. Generally speaking, if the answers contain numbers or dates or times, you will hear distractors and you will probably hear information which sounds like all three answers. In the question, the key word is start, and this is another reason why we know we will probably get distractors. We will probably hear the time when most guests will come and a time when some guests will come late, but we don't care about that. We want to know when guests will start arriving. So we're listening for a word that means the same thing as start. Let's look at another example. This question says, food waste reports should emphasize, and then our answers are A, food production, B, transportation of food to landfills, C, distribution of food products. The word food is used in all three answers, and food production in answer A and food products in answer B sound very similar. So one of them is probably the correct answer and the other one is the distractor. Generally speaking, if a couple of answers contain words which are very similar, you will hear distractors and you will probably hear information which sounds like all three answers. Now let's look at another example. Anna and Robert decide to begin their presentation by A, distributing a questionnaire, B, providing statistical evidence, C, showing images of wasted food. You can see that this question uses the word decide. This is one of three very important words which you should always look for in multiple choice questions. You always get these questions in section 3. I call these agree, decide, conclude questions because they always have the word agree or, these days, possibly disagree, or decide or conclude in the question. Usually, you see these question types at least once in section 3 of the listening test, but you can get them more often in that section. Those words agree, conclude, and decide are important because they all describe something which happens at the end of a process. For these questions, you will hear two people have a mini conversation about the subject of the question, and at the end of that mini conversation, they will eventually agree, decide, or conclude. When this happens, you will probably hear information which sounds like all three answers, so you need to listen very carefully to determine which one they select in the end. Very often, you also hear the people speaking change their mind. So don't choose the first answer you hear. They might mention the first answer and then reject it. They might even mention the second answer and then reject that. Sometimes they will even mention the third answer and then reject that. And now you'll be confused because they've mentioned and rejected all three answers. What they will do then is go back and decide on one of the answers after all. And that will be the correct answer. Another kind of special multiple choice question is the attitude question. In this question, you are asked about an attitude held by one of the speakers. Let's look at this example. When discussing the present research, Maya is surprised that A. Ordinary people have altered their habits. B. The findings are very detailed. C. Most babies behave the same way. In this case, the key word is surprised. We will probably not hear exactly the word surprised, but we will hear a word that means the same thing. When you get an attitude question like this, focus on the attitude word. Very often, it will be an adjective. It's worth knowing that IELTS has some favorite attitudes that it asks you about. These four attitudes are surprised, interested, concerned, and impressed. When you see one of these attitude words in the question, you should be listening for a word that means the same kind of thing as that attitude, because you probably won't hear exactly that word. This is testing your knowledge of paraphrase. You need to think of a word which has basically the same meaning as that word, but is another word. Be careful to think of a word which matches the word in the question very closely. For example, the main idea of surprised is something happened and you didn't know it was going to happen. So you should be listening for words like didn't expect, didn't realize, wasn't aware. The main idea of the word interested is something that catches your attention and makes you think about it. So instead of hearing that the student was interested, you might hear that they were curious. Concerned means that something is making you worried. So you might even hear the person in the listening exercise say they are worried about something. Impressed is the idea that something happened and it gave you a feeling that it's really good. You might hear a word like amazed in this case. As I said before, you will get agree, decide, conclude questions and attitude questions in section 3. Sometimes a multiple choice question will ask you to select 2 answers, in which case you will have 5 options. Don't worry about the number of options, just treat this in the same way as the normal multiple choice question, which has 1 question and 3 possible answers. Sometimes you'll get a kind of multiple choice question which has the answers in a box. When that happens, you will sometimes get more questions than answers, and sometimes you will get more answers than questions. If you have more answers than questions, then you know you are going to hear distractors. In fact, you are probably going to hear something which sounds like all of the answers, and this means you'll need to be aware of distractors. You will probably hear the words in the questions, so in your preview time, read through the words in the answers and think about how to paraphrase them. Think, what's another way to say this? And how could they say this differently? When you get the answers in the box and you have more questions than answers, for example, you have 5 questions but only 3 answers, then you know they are going to have to use some of these answers more than once. And this means they are going to have to paraphrase them. So again, what you should do in your preview time is read through the words in the answers and think, what's another way to say this? How could they paraphrase this? We'll look at these questions in more detail in another video. See the link in the video description for more information. When you are answering multiple choice questions, it can be a good idea, if you have time, to write 1 or 2 words next to each question which remind you about why you chose this answer. Review. During your review time after the listening exercise has finished, there's not much you can do to check that your multiple choice answers are definitely correct. Still, it can be valuable to read over your answers again and any notes you've made in case you remember something which makes you decide you need to change an answer.